Now, meanwhile, Democrats are launching an all-out assault on Jill Stein. She is another loose end that they have to clean up. So while they have all the secretaries who are prognosticating election delays, saying everything's totally in order, which is what they say every time, and it's never in order. We saw that happen in Arizona with onesie-twosie Bill Gates and Stephen Richer out there saying the election was perfect, even though people were standing in lines trying to vote for Carrie Lake for hours. Now, they said Miss Stein is back on the ballot almost everywhere that matters. Oh, returning to the campaign floor in an ostensible coin flip race between Trump and Kamala. Now, while Stein condemns both zombie political parties, which I think is fair, they both like the Republican Party, other than the Trump carve out here. It's like Mitch McConnell and Mitt Romney. Give me a break. Her campaign has focused largely on hammering Harris, blaming the White House for the violence in Gaza. And this is a big problem for the Kamala campaign in Michigan. There are articles out there that they're hitting the panic button there too, because of her position on that conflict, saying basically nothing, that we're going to keep doing what Joe Biden is doing. We can't give up. We can't give up. What? You're going to keep funding both sides of the conflict and pushing for a ceasefire that is not going to happen anytime soon? Okay, the party has prepared a negative ad blitz to go against Miss Stein, and Democrats, as never before, are going to be hitting her. In its first such effort ever directed at a third-party candidate. Look, man, they're nuts. They're going on a negative ad blitz. They're fearful that Stein might divert critical votes in places like Michigan. Democrats are also pressing their case on billboards plastered recently across swing states. They're saying, Jill Stein helped Trump once. Don't let her do it again. And I think we appreciate Jill Stein in one way. There definitely are people, I've spoken to them, who say, I just can't vote for Trump. And they're the Kennedy people. And I think I mentioned this before earlier when I was speaking with a woman. I loved Kennedy. I had just gone and met Kennedy at the event with Tucker, and it was amazing. And so I was explaining this to her. Gosh, I love him so much. It's so amazing and all the things. And we had the conversation about where he was going. Come join Team Maha. If you don't like MAGA, join Maha and come join us to make America healthy again, you know? She's like, oh, God, and you're just hemming and hawing about it. And so in my gut, I don't know that she's going to jump on and vote for Trump. But Jill Stein, for those people who are out there, if they're not going to stay home and if they're not going to vote for Trump, we'd rather them have an outlet of Jill Stein, let's say, rather than Kamala. We'd rather it go to Jill than Kamala, which is why the Democrats are so freaked. And they're trying to get her off the ballot and they're launching an onslaught. They recognize that. They're like, oh, crap, there's another option. So that's not good. And Jill Stein is a very unique person in Michigan and other places where there are large Arab American populations that are upset about what's happening in Gaza. And she is there talking against the violence there, saying it needs to stop. Perfect. It's a nice option for that demographic. Now, for the last 8 years, Stein has taken her place as a peace-peddling, Democrat-bashing, Republican-aided, formerly Russian-boosted villain of the left. The hell kind of sentence is that? From the Times? Was this Times? Yeah. In 2016, she got 1.5 million votes. Wow. Her support in the decisive states in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania exceeded Trump's margin of victories in 2016. Some national polls have her around 1%. And so they're coming after her hard. She's saying, I'm not a spoiler. Maybe you guys should have a better candidate who's not Kamala. It is happening everywhere. All the swing states are being targeted. The secretaries and the Democrats gearing up for the final hour. Now, let's turn our attention over to Michigan here, because this is one way that they're going to exploit the rules. Jocelyn Benson, the secretary from Michigan, celebrates a victory. Those overseas ballots are going to be coming in, even from people who didn't reside in Michigan, opposed to Michigan law. According to the Michigan Republican Party, against Jocelyn, they're saying that these votes shouldn't count. And now they will, because Jocelyn and a judge said so. So she's celebrating this, saying a win for voters and democracy today in Michigan. And we're going to show you how they're exploiting this, because this is happening not only in Michigan, but it's in many other states. It's an exploit using the UOCAVA ballots. It is the Uniformed Overseas Active Service people, and it's also overseas voters who are not necessarily active duty, active military. So we have to distinguish between the two. But here's what she posted. It says, a federal court upheld our work to ensure that military service members and their families serving overseas can vote, which is a very sympathetic class. We love our military. We love our service members. We love the people who sacrifice for our country and contribute. And so, of course, we want them to participate in our elections. That makes total sense. But what about the overseas voters? And what about the overseas voters, more specifically, who aren't actually voters, who are dependents or relatives to these overseas voters, who then want to register through the overseas voter in order to get permission to vote? They're now going to have that ability. So she says this is an 11th hour attempt to disenfranchise these electors, which of course is not true at all. But this is why this is a big number and why this is important. From usafacts.org, question is asked, how many immigrants are in Michigan? It's a pretty big number. About 7.3% of the population, roughly 3 in 40 residents in Michigan are immigrants. Okay, 738,000 people. So immigrants who are defined by this study as foreign-born residents, which includes people who became U.S. citizens, so foreign-born residents and maybe U.S. citizens, are authorized to come to work to the U.S. for work or are undocumented residents. So big group, right? Undocumented, authorized to come to work in the U.S. And there's a certain bucket of these people who are citizens, who are overseas, and who are eligible to vote. So how many? I don't know. Do you think it's half who are overseas? No, probably not. Do you think it's 10%, maybe 5%? Is it 50,000? Is it 20,000? I don't know. But now let's take that bucket. Let's say if there are 738 here, presumably there's probably a contingent that went also back home and travels back and forth and does all the things. So that's a big number. Of that, if there are people who are citizens who go overseas, can they overseas then register their dependents who have never been to the United States, have never resided in Michigan? Can they register them to vote through that overseas person? Answer is yes, they can, because that's what a federal judge just said, even though they've never resided in Michigan. Here is the order. Now, the claim comes from the Michigan Republican Party and the RNC and Cindy Berry versus Jocelyn Benson. The case is arising out of the state of Michigan in the Court of Claims. Now, this is the opinion and the order denying the RNC's request for summary disposition and granting Jocelyn Benson's victory. Now, this is from the Court of Claims, which is a state court from the state of Michigan. And I thought she just said this was a federal court, saying a federal court upheld, which I do not believe she has her courts correct. But here's what the opinion says. It says, okay, now the opinion and order. So this is from the judge, and this judge is from the Court of Claims in the state of Michigan, telling us the following. Now, undoubtedly, the right to vote's important, and says disenfranchisement of a right to vote is a pretty serious thing. Writes, at any given time, tens of thousands of United States citizens, including Michigan residents, live abroad, serving our country in the armed forces and the diplomatic corps. Others live abroad for civilian purposes. And so I want to pay close attention to this. Every time you hear the Democrats talk about UOCAVA, the framing, the positioning, which are very important concepts in the law and in persuasion and in politics, they position and they frame this as though this is enfranchising our armed men and women. We're not asking them to do that. They already do that. We're not challenging that. Okay, that's not why we're here. We are asking about this second bucket, which they never reference. Others living abroad for civilian purposes, whatever those purposes are. Sometimes spouses and dependents accompany these overseas United States citizens sacrificing for the good of their families. Yeah. And sometimes the spouses and these dependents leave the United States before registering to vote or are born and raised overseas, reaching the age of suffrage without ever residing in this state or country. Okay, so they're foreigners who never lived in the United States, and they're connected to somebody via birth overseas, or they're through marriage, or they're a dependent, right? So this is a broad category. There's many different permutations of who these people could be. The judge says Congress protects the rights of these citizens to vote, and so does Michigan. So at 4:09 on the 28th day before this election, the Republicans sought a declaration invalidating instructions that were issued by Jocelyn, right? So this is what happens all the time. Jocelyn and the director of elections, they wrote instructions. So in their election manual, they changed the manuals, not the law, designed to allow the spouses and the dependents to register and cast their votes. So you're married to someone, or you're a kid or somebody, you're allowed. You can register and cast their votes. Now, are they checking their citizenship? I don't have any idea. Like, they should be citizens, obviously, but let's see. So what they say is Latches. So this is this judge, Latches. Now, he is going to get to the merits on this, but he says Latches bars this 11th hour attempt to disenfranchise these voters. And Latches, again, is the concept that you caused the delay and you caused the harm. And so we're not going to allow you to bring a complaint or a claim because it's going to disadvantage the opposing party at the last minute. Like, you brought it too late and we're not going to allow you to get a remedy. So you can't bring it. Furthermore, the challenged language, so what Jocelyn changed in the manual, is lawful anyways under the law. And so she can succeed. So these votes will count. Let's zoom in. Now, at stake in this case is the right of the spouses and the dependents of absent uniformed service and overseas voters, so the military and overseas, to register to vote and to cast absent voter ballots in Michigan. So now we're thinking about election exploits and how could they do this? They just need one overseas citizen, and then they declare, I'm a spouse, I'm a dependent, and then they can fill out an absentee voter ballot, theoretically. The subject group members do not currently live in Michigan, and they can't vote in person, nor can they easily drop their ballot off to vote in person or to remedy the alleged deficiencies in their absentee ballots before November 5th. And so given this reality, the law protects the right of them to vote by absentee ballot. Now, the federal government requires states to permit these people, as well as their spouses and dependents, to vote. The Uniform Overseas Act, the UOCAVA, requires states to permit this to happen. The federal act defines these people as the following: spouse or dependent of a member referred to in one of these subsections who is absent from the state, but who's otherwise qualified to vote. And this is very specific. So absent uniform service voter means the following. And so member of the Merchant Marine, active duty, or a spouse of one of the two. Overseas voters is broader. An absent uniform service voter who, by reason of active duty or services, is absent. A person who resides outside the United States and is qualified to vote in the last place they were domiciled before leaving. So that's super broad, right? Anybody who leaves, basically, you're now an overseas voter, as long as you were domiciled as a resident in that state for a bit. A person who resides outside the U.S., but would be qualified to vote in the last place in which they were domiciled, right? So you can go overseas and still vote absentee. Now, Michigan amended its election laws to implement that, and the law provides that a qualified elector must live in the municipality for at least 30 days. The legislature generally defines residence as the following. Residence means, where you sleep, where you spend more of your time, and you don't gain or lose residence while engaged in the service of the United States. But they said more specifically that overseas voters can also request ballots by mail. So a spouse or dependent overseas voter who is a citizen is accompanying that overseas voter and is not qualified anywhere else can register to vote. And so more rules. Now, the Republicans, they take issue with the language in the manual. Okay, so he gave us the rules. Now, the manual says the following. So Jocelyn Benson then took those rules and then wrote a manual and said, to be eligible to register to vote, if the voter is a civilian, the voter must be living outside the United States if you're eligible under these things. The voter is a member of active duty or a National Guardsman, or if the voter is a dependent of a member of any of the listed organizations, the voter is eligible to register to vote using the forms, regardless of whether the voter is serving overseas or inside the U.S. Each UOCAVA voter must submit their own form, saying a United States citizen who has never resided in the United States, but who has a parent or spouse or guardian who is last living in is eligible to vote in Michigan as long as the citizen is not registered to vote in another state. So in this bucket, then, we've got people who have never, ever apparently resided in, maybe they've been to the United States, but their parent was, and they should be a citizen. So if you're in that category, a voter then may register to vote in the jurisdiction in which they are registering, even if someone else now resides at that address, if the building has been demolished or if the address no longer exists. So that's interesting. Apparently, this is also in the manual. The only requirement is that the address be supplied as the last address, and so we don't even need a valid address, so the building can be destroyed. Now, they filed suit saying that the manual violates this. Every citizen of the U.S. who has attained the age of 21, who has resided this, meets the requirement of this. The legislature shall define residency for our purposes. So they say, wait, no, the Constitution says you must be a resident for 6 months and that the federal law preempts this, and you have to at least have personally resided in Michigan. So if you're a spouse or dependent and you haven't ever basically touched foot in Michigan, like you have to relate back to your state, you can't vote in that state. Plaintiffs seek a declaration in the manual's provision that a spouse or dependent is eligible to vote despite never living in the United States. That's invalid. So those people have to not count for Michigan. They don't challenge the constitutionality of the Michigan statutes, of course. Now, we've got it back and forth. The state, Jocelyn Benson, responds. They say no. They say, first of all, you didn't give us proper notice with the Court of Claims. And second, latches. This challenge could have been raised at any time after 2017 and should have been brought up to the year earlier. It's too close to the election, and now we're already voting, essentially. And so and this is the argument that is successful. They win on this. Third, they say that the harm is merely hypothetical. Jocelyn also says that the Constitution allows them to define this exactly how they want. So the RNC obviously filed a cross motion, as we see here. And the judge is going to give us some standards of review. So what are the rules? And then we get to some analysis. So let's see what the judge says. They say, all right, Jocelyn Benson says the action must be dismissed. They didn't give us any notice that they were going to be filing this claim. Now, this tells us what is required before you sue the state. Remember, the state makes it extra hard to sue them because they're special. And they say, given all of this, the verified complaint was received within the notice period. So Jocelyn loses on that. You had plenty of notice. So this case survives on that regard. Now, standing, we see this comes up all the time. Jocelyn also says you have no standing. The court has considered the pleadings. And as we see, Clerk Barry has a clear interest in how these are tabulated. And so she doesn't know how to tabulate these things when they come in across her desk because she's the clerk. And so therefore, there is at least one area where this could be harmful. And so we deny that there is standing at least a little bit. Now, how about latches? The concept being that to stop a party that caused an improper delay in asserting the right. You waited too long, and so you lose. There certainly was delay here. They filed their action at the end of October. Now, while this was 28 days before the election, the court only had 27 days to review this and didn't serve them until 25 days And they filed their complaint after the final day of the absentee voters went out. Ballots went out. It says, first and foremost, the judge says, Michigan electors have already begun casting their absentee voter ballots. In fact, 31% of those have already come in. There are two areas of prejudice now. How are the government officials supposed to remedy this and cull the bad ballots from the good ballots? And now the Republicans say, we just want to challenge the manual. That's it. Just revise the manual. It's undisputed that the effect is that individuals who have registered to vote in Michigan have already cast their ballots and they're going to be rendered ineligible. And this would be a purge of an entire group of people, says the government. And we're not allowed to do that, okay? The U.S. law says we can't do that. We're too close to an election. And so if we're going to systematically eliminate these problematic ballots, now's not the time to do it. It would be extremely difficult or impossible for them to design and carry this out. The Secretary of State, Jocelyn, is the chief election officer, and she's got control over this. And so she's responsible for various tasks like this. She's got no process in place to distinguish these from other votes. Now, they're busy with a bunch of other stuff in the final days leading up to this election. And so to require them to create an entirely new process, wow, that's a lot of prejudice. So with so little time left, the general election right around the corner, and extreme prejudice, leaving a heavy burden on the government, this request is barred by laches. And so Jocelyn Benson wins. Now, although the court dismisses this case, let me address it on the merits because I know this will come back. He says, as an executive agency, the secretary has the authority to do what she did. These interpretations are not binding, and the manual falls into this category. It doesn't have the effect of the law, but rather it interprets the statutes, and the interpretation just must be within the scope of the law. So as long as she's not like clearly violating the law, she can do it. The focus on the Constitution and the residency requirement for 6 months, by the way, that's already been overturned in a Supreme Court case. They said you can't have 6-month residency requirements because it penalizes new voters, which is true. But the point here is not exactly that. It's not about necessarily the length of the residency requirement. It's about a residency requirement. So they say no. So this judge, it's a little sneaky. He says, no, the Supreme Court said you can't have 6-month residency requirements because it's too long. Like then you'll have people that move into your state and there's a 6-month hiatus status where they can't vote anywhere. So that is depriving them of their right to vote, which I understand and I can relate to that. But you still have to have residency at least sometime, right? Like at some point. Like if you're there, if you move there even for 1 minute, okay, you can register to vote and vote. But at least you're there. So he's getting rid of it by saying the Supreme Court already eliminated durational requirements, but we're not really talking about durational requirements. It's just a single touchback. Moreover, this provision must be read in light of the mandate that the legislature has the power to define some of these things. The challenge manual language does not quote the statute verbatim, but it doesn't intend to. And so she's allowed to do what she wants. In fact, the legislature made a policy choice to allow a small pool of individuals to accompany their family members abroad to qualify as residents, even if they've never lived here as a resident, and they're only doing it through their spouse, parent, or look, someone serving a parental role. See that? Someone serving a parental role. So how many people can you register over there? Hey, you want to be my kid for this month? Awesome. How about you? How about you? How about you? The manual explains to local election officials that applications and absentee ballots from these spouses and dependents are to be tabulated even though they never lived in Michigan. Rather, the subject group is to be treated as the same resident for voting purposes. And the manual is close enough within coloring within the lines. And so, of course, Jocelyn Benson wins. And so the manual says that a citizen who has never resided in the States but has a guardian spouse or who was last domiciled in Michigan is eligible to vote in Michigan as long as the citizen is not registered or voted in another state. Now, the other thing that is not talked about here is they are registered to vote, and they keep saying this word citizen, but no one's checking. And if they fill out a social security number with just a number in there, they put 7245, 8719, whatever the numbers are, which is not my social, I think. They're not checking it in various locations. They say the Constitution granted the authority to the legislature to define residency. Even if plaintiff's challenge was meritorious, the court would deny relief under laches because you brought it too late. And so therefore, Jocelyn's motion is granted and the complaint is dismissed with prejudice. Jocelyn Benson wins. Signed by Seema G. Patel, judge from the Court of Claims there in the state of Michigan. And so that bucket of votes will count. Now, how big is that bucket of votes? How consequential is that bucket of votes? Who knows? Time will tell. We'll keep our eye on it. But another secretary in another state, the person who's in charge of keeping the score, is fighting very hard and is very happy about the fact that other people who've never even been to Michigan or resided in Michigan can now just declare, we've got some connection to the state, fill out a form, and she's going to check it, allegedly. We'll keep our eye on it. The election is right around the corner.